Here's what the Queen Mother drank on a typical Tuesday. At noon, always noon, a gin and Dubonnet arrived. 2 parts Dubonnet, 1 part gin, over ice with a slice of lemon. She'd have 2 of those. Then champagne with lunch. Not supermarket champagne. Krug, or Veuve Clicquot. 2, sometimes 3 glasses. Late afternoon brought a dry martini, one of the strongest standard cocktails you can make. Wine with dinner, which was always a formal multi-course affair. And after the plates were cleared, port. Every day, 7 days a week, for over 50 years. One man poured nearly all of it. His name was William Tallon. Everyone called him Backstairs Billy. He arrived at Clarence House in 1951, a teenager from a working-class family in Coventry, hired as a lowly steward's boy, the very bottom of the royal domestic ladder. He was 17 years old. The Queen Mother was 51, newly widowed after King George VI's death on February 6, 1952, and settling into a grief that briefly threatened to swallow her whole. Tallon would serve her for the next 51 years, rising from steward's boy to page of the backstairs, a title that sounds quaint but carried enormous practical power. The page of the backstairs controlled physical access to the royal employer. He decided who got through the door and who didn't. He managed the private quarters, oversaw the daily domestic rituals, and, crucially, he mixed the drinks. Every single day. By the time he'd been at Clarence House for a decade, Tallon wasn't just a servant. He was a gatekeeper, and the gate he kept was oiled with gin. To understand what made Tallon extraordinary, and what makes his story a darker mirror of the Queen Mother's impossible survival, you have to understand Clarence House itself. The Nash-designed residence on the Mall was the Queen Mother's London home from 1953 until her death in 2002. It housed an estimated 50 or more full-time staff. There were butlers, pages, footmen, dressers, chefs, chauffeurs, ladies-in-waiting, and sundry domestic workers, all arranged in a hierarchy as rigid and detailed as anything in the military. At the top of the domestic staff sat, in theory, the steward, for many years Sir Alistair Aird, but in practice, the person with the most intimate daily access to the Queen Mother, the person who controlled the private rhythms of her life, was Tallon. He was flamboyant, openly gay in an era when that carried real risk, even in the relatively tolerant atmosphere of the royal household, fiercely loyal, wickedly funny by most accounts, and absolutely ruthless about protecting his position. Tallon feuded with Aird and with other senior staff for decades, territorial battles over access, influence, and the Queen Mother's attention. These weren't polite disagreements. They were vicious, protracted campaigns conducted through passive aggression, strategic gossip, and the most powerful weapon in Tallon's arsenal, the fact that he was the one who brought her the first drink at noon and cleared the last glass after midnight. He knew her moods. He knew when she needed cheering. He knew exactly how to pour. And here's the thing about that dynamic. The drinks weren't just hospitality. They were currency. Tallon understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that the Queen Mother's daily ritual of consumption was the organizing principle of her entire household. The gin and Dubonnet signaled the start of the social day. The champagne at lunch set the tone for conversation. The pre-dinner martini loosened the evening. The port closed it. Control the drinks, and you control the schedule. Control the schedule, and you control who gets FaceTime with the most beloved woman in Britain. Tallon controlled the drinks for 51 years. So let's do the math on what he was pouring. The gin and Dubonnet before lunch, 2 large measures at her preferred ratio, comes to roughly 4 to 5 UK alcohol units. Champagne at lunch, 2 to 3 glasses, another 3 to 4 units. The pre-dinner martini adds at least 2.5 units, probably more. Major Colin Burgess, who served as equerry to the Queen Mother in the early 1990s and later wrote about it in his 2006 memoir, Behind Palace Doors, was responsible for mixing that martini himself on occasion. Wine with dinner. 3 to 4 glasses across multiple courses. Call it 4 to 5 units. Port after. Another 1 to 2 units. Add it up and you're looking at somewhere between 14 and 18 units on a quiet day. Multiply by 7. That's 98 to 126 units per week. The UK Chief Medical Officer's guideline for low-risk drinking is 14 units per week. Total. The Queen Mother was consuming that before lunch was over. She lived to 101. Now, before we go further, let's be honest about the sourcing. Nobody was standing behind the Queen Mother with a clipboard and a breathalyzer. The 70 drinks a week figure comes not from a clinical measurement, but from an aggregation of staff accounts. The two most detailed sources are Burgess and Tallon himself. Burgess described her daily routine with the matter-of-fact precision of a military officer, which is exactly what he was. He wasn't sensational about it. He simply recorded what he saw during his 2-year posting inside Clarence House. The gin and Dubonnet at noon, the champagne at lunch, the martini before dinner, the wine, the port. He laid it out like a logistics report. Tallon's account came through a different channel, journalists, friends, and eventually a 2009 Channel 4 documentary called Backstairs Billy, the Queen Mum's Butler. Tallon was flamboyant, where Burgess was precise. Devoted, where Burgess was professional. And considerably less restrained in his descriptions of household life. But the essential facts matched. The drinking was not chaotic, not furtive. It was orderly, ritualized, and completely embedded in the rhythm of the day, as natural as breakfast. Could the accounts be exaggerated? Sure. Tallon had a flair for drama, and memoir writers aren't always scrupulous with quantities. Knock 20% off the estimates, you're still looking at a woman consuming 50-plus drinks a week for half a century. And that's where the biology gets impossible. Here's what sustained heavy drinking, 10 or more drinks per day, which is roughly what she was doing, does to the human body over time. Start with the liver. At her consumption levels, fatty liver disease would typically develop within a few years. That's the mild stage, reversible if you stop. She didn't stop. The next stage is alcoholic hepatitis, inflammation that scars the liver tissue. After that comes cirrhosis, irreversible scarring that progressively destroys the organ's ability to function. Studies show that between 10 and 20% of heavy drinkers develop cirrhosis within 10 to 20 years. At her level of consumption, sustained for 5 decades, the cumulative probability is staggering. No liver disease was ever reported. The heart. Chronic heavy drinking causes alcoholic cardiomyopathy. The heart muscle weakens, stretches, can't pump blood efficiently. Atrial fibrillation risk climbs sharply. The Queen Mother had no reported cardiac events until the very end of her life. The brain. Long-term heavy alcohol use causes measurable gray matter loss. It kills neurons. It depletes thiamine, leading to Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, a devastating neurological condition that produces confusion, memory loss, and eventually permanent brain damage. 50 years of drinking at her level should have produced significant cognitive decline by her 70s or 80s at the latest. People who knew her in her 90s described a woman who was sharp, witty, and socially commanding. And cancer. Alcohol is a Group 1 carcinogen, same classification as tobacco and asbestos. Heavy consumption massively elevates the risk of cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, and breast. No cancer diagnosis was ever publicly reported. Actuarial models for someone consuming 70 drinks a week, starting in their 40s or 50s, would predict death decades before 101. The average chronic heavy drinker at her consumption level doesn't make it past their 60s or 70s. She blew past both milestones without apparent difficulty. And here's the contrast that makes it land harder. Her husband, King George VI, was a heavy smoker. Smoked throughout his adult life, developed arteriosclerosis and Buerger's disease, had his left lung removed in September 1951 after a malignant tumor was discovered. Died February 6, 1952, of a coronary thrombosis. He was 56. The smoker died at 56. The drinker lived another 50 years. Tallon was there for the king's death. He was barely 18, still new to the household, when the Queen Mother became a widow. He watched her grieve. He watched her retreat into Clarence House. He watched her buy the Castle of May, a remote, partially ruined 16th-century castle on the northernmost coast of Caithness, Scotland, overlooking the Pentland Firth, as though she needed to stand at the literal edge of Britain to process what had happened. He watched her restore it at enormous expense, and he traveled with her there every August and October for decades. 3 residences, Clarence House, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Castle of May, all fully staffed year-round. And at every one, Tallon was the constant. The drinks appeared at noon no matter where she was. He was also drinking. That's the detail that turns this from a medical curiosity into something genuinely tragic. Tallon didn't just pour, he partook, heavily, for decades. The drinking culture at Clarence House wasn't confined to the upstairs rooms where the Queen Mother held court. It seeped downstairs, into the servants' quarters, where Tallon hosted his own legendary parties. He was known for entertaining friends, lovers, and fellow staff members in the Clarence House basement, where the drinks flowed with the same generosity as they did in the dining room above. The boundary between upstairs drinking and downstairs drinking was, by all accounts, porous. The supply was essentially unlimited, and Tallon helped himself. But here's what separates his story from hers, and it isn't just genetics. The Queen Mother never missed a meal. She ate multi-course dinners prepared by professional chefs, using the finest ingredients available. Her diet was rich, varied, and nutritionally dense every single day for 100 years. Most chronic alcoholics are malnourished. Alcohol suppresses appetite, displaces food, depletes essential vitamins, particularly the thiamine, whose absence causes the brain damage we already discussed. The Queen Mother was never malnourished for one day of her life. That buffer, the sheer quality of what she ate alongside what she drank, may have been one of the most important factors in her survival. She also had the best physicians in Britain monitoring her health continuously. Not a GP with a 6-week waiting list. Immediate access to any specialist in the country. Early detection, proactive management, regular monitoring. The kind of medical oversight that most humans will never experience. In 1966, she had surgery to remove a partial bowel obstruction. No alcohol-related pathology was indicated. In 1982, a fishbone lodged in her throat during a meal. It was removed without complication. These were the only notable health events reported across decades of sustained consumption that should have produced catastrophic organ damage. Either problems were suppressed with remarkable discipline, or they simply didn't exist. And the genetics. Her father Claude, 14th Earl of Strathmore, died in 1944 at 80. Her mother Cecilia died in 1938 at 75. Several siblings lived into their 70s and 80s. Some people carry variants of the alcohol dehydrogenase gene that allow them to metabolize alcohol more efficiently, clearing it faster and reducing toxic buildup. We don't have the Queen Mother's genome, But her family tree points towards something exceptional in the biological hardware. Tallon had none of this. No personal chef, no round-the-clock medical team, no genetic lottery ticket from the Scottish aristocracy. He was a working-class kid from Coventry who'd spent his entire adult life in service, and when the service ended, everything ended with it. The Queen Mother died on March 30th, 2002. She was 101. No organ failure, no liver collapse, no catastrophic alcohol-related event. She'd had a hip replacement, not unusual at her age. She simply wound down, at an age most humans never reach, regardless of what they drink or don't drink. And Tallon was cast out. After 51 years of service, he was given a grace and favor flat in Kennington, South London, a world away from the chandeliers and champagne flutes of Clarence House. The transition was brutal. He went from being the most powerful domestic servant in the British royal household to being a pensioner in a 2-bedroom flat. The structure that had organized his entire adult life, the noon drinks, the evening service, the rituals, the purpose, vanished overnight. The Queen Mother had been the axis around which everything turned, and without her, Tallon spun into freefall. He kept drinking. Of course, he kept drinking. But now, there were no multi-course dinners to buffer the alcohol. No world-class medical team monitoring his liver enzymes. No social calendar packed with engagements to keep him upright and functional. No castle in Scotland to visit in August. Just a flat in Kennington and the same habit he'd shared with a woman who'd somehow been immune to it. The decline was swift by comparison. Tallon grew increasingly isolated. His health deteriorated visibly. The same alcohol that had never seemed to touch the Queen Mother, not her liver, not her heart, not her mind, did what the medical textbooks say it does to everyone else. 5 years after the Queen Mother's death, William Tallon was dead. He was 72. Same household, same bottles, same decades. One lived to 101. The other didn't make it to 73. And that contrast tells you something the medical literature alone can't. It tells you that the Queen Mother's survival wasn't just about biology. It was about infrastructure. She was the most expensively maintained functional alcoholic in British history. And that word, maintained, is doing an enormous amount of work. £4 million a year in household costs, 50-plus staff at Clarence House, 3 residences, a racing stable. She was one of the most prominent owners in national hunt racing, steeplechasing, and she followed bloodlines and form with the detail of a professional trainer. She died owing Cootes Bank between £4 and £7 million in overdrafts, debts that Queen Elizabeth II is understood to have quietly absorbed. She was patron or president of more than 300 charitable organizations, including what was then called the Royal Society for Mentally Handicapped Children and Adults, now MENCAP. She opened hospitals, visited care homes, lent her name to causes addressing health, welfare, disability, and the care of vulnerable people. A woman consuming 8 to 12 times the recommended alcohol limit, running up millions in debt, maintaining a 50-person household on public money, while serving as the nation's figurehead of maternal warmth and charitable concern. No newspaper ever called her an alcoholic. Not once. The British press's relationship with the Queen Mother was unique even by the standards of royal deference. She was the woman who'd stayed in London during the Blitz, who'd said after Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." That wartime image, brave, steadfast, unkillable, became a shield no editor would pierce. When her drinking was mentioned, it was an endearing quirk. She enjoys a tipple, a wink, a nudge. Tallon got no such protection. After the Queen Mother's death, he was the subject of exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd been shielded from. The 2009 Channel 4 documentary aired his life, his drinking, his feuds, his sexuality, all of it laid out for public consumption. He couldn't stop it. He had no press office, no wartime mythology, no 300 charitable patronages to serve as a buffer between himself and the tabloids. He was just an old servant with a drinking problem and good stories. And when the stories ran out, nobody was left to pour for. Winston Churchill, the obvious comparison, drank weak whiskey and soda at breakfast, Pol Roger champagne at lunch, and brandy through the afternoon and evening. He made it to 90, dying on January 24, 1965, though he accumulated a heart attack in 1941 and the major stroke in 1953 along the way. The Queen Mother accumulated almost nothing. Churchill had wealth, access to excellent medical care, and the same class armor, but even he showed damage. She didn't. So, what's the answer? Honestly, we don't entirely have one. Some combination of extraordinary genetics, world-class nutrition, constant medical surveillance, relentless social engagement, and sheer biological luck allowed one woman to sustain a consumption pattern that would have killed almost anyone else. She is not evidence that heavy drinking is safe. The overwhelming medical data says it kills, and Tallon's own death is proof enough of that. She's the exception so extreme, it exposes the limits of what we actually understand about how alcohol interacts with individual biology. But there's a second answer embedded in Tallon's story, and it's less comfortable than the first. The Queen Mother survived partly because she could afford to. Not just financially, though £4 million a year certainly helps, but structurally. She was surrounded every hour of every day by people whose entire job was to keep her alive and comfortable. Tallon was one of those people. He poured the drinks, he managed the moods, he kept the household running so she never had to confront a single practical consequence of her consumption. And when she was gone, and nobody was doing the same for him, the alcohol did exactly what the textbooks said it would. Who gets to be a functional alcoholic? Not Tallon. Not most people. You need the staff, the chef, the doctors, the money, the press silence, and a dose of genetic fortune so improbable that medical science still can't fully explain it. Backstairs Billy knew all of this. Not in clinical terms. He wasn't reading medical journals in his Kennington flat. But he'd lived inside the experiment for half a century. He'd watched the same substance destroy him and leave her untouched. And he'd kept pouring anyway, because that was the job. And the job was his entire identity. And without it, he was just a man in South London with a glass in his hand, and nobody left to serve. The most expensively maintained functional alcoholic in British history died at 101, owing millions to a bank that never called, surrounded by staff who never told, covered by a press that never asked. Her most loyal servant died 5 years later, alone, in a flat paid for by the grace of the family he'd spent his life serving. Somewhere between those two deaths is everything you need to know about class, biology, and the strange arithmetic of survival. Subscribe for more stories like this.